That Expendable, a British destroyer that held the Narvik Fjord for 9 hours against 5 German destroyers. The 9th of April, 1940. Ofotfjord, Norway. In the grey pre-dawn, 10 German destroyers had already completed one of the most audacious naval operations of the war, slipping through fog and heavy snow to seize the iron ore port of Narvik, overwhelming its coastal defenders and landing nearly 2,000 mountain troops. The Kriegsmarine had its prize, and by every calculation available to the British Admiralty that morning, holding it would not be difficult. Britain's response, when it came, would have to run up a narrow fjord against heavily armed German warships on home ground, with no air cover, in waters the enemy now controlled. The destroyers assigned to that response were fast, they were determined, but in the strategic arithmetic of April 1940, they were considered, quite frankly, expendable. What happened over the 9 hours that followed would force every accountant of naval power in the North Atlantic to revise their arithmetic entirely. This is how. To understand why Narvik mattered enough to spend ships on, you have to follow the iron ore. The port sits at the mouth of Ofotfjord in northern Norway, ice-free year-round, connected by rail to the mines at Kiruna in Swedish Lapland. Through that single harbour moved the bulk of the iron ore on which German industrial production depended. 90% of Germany's iron ore arriving by sea passed through Narvik. Churchill had understood this before the war began. The British Admiralty had wargamed it. The Germans understood it too, which is precisely why Adolf Hitler, on the 1st of March 1940, ordered Operation Weserübung, the simultaneous invasion of Denmark and Norway, and committed to it nearly the whole of the operational Kriegsmarine. Group I of the invasion fleet departed Bremerhaven on the 6th of April. It was a powerful force, 10 destroyers of the 1934A and 1936 classes, among them the Georg Thiele, Wolfgang Zenker, Bernd von Arnim, Erich Giese, Erich Koellner, Diether von Roeder, Hans Lüdemann, Hermann Künne, the flagship Wilhelm Heidkamp, and Anton Schmitt, all under Kommodore Friedrich Bonte. Each ship carried approximately 200 soldiers drawn from the 139th Mountain Regiment of General Eduard Diethel's 3rd Mountain Division, a total of 1,900 Gebirgsjäger. They were screened for most of the voyage by the battleships Starnhorst and Neisner. On paper, this was a well-protected, heavily armed, and numerically substantial force. The Norwegian defenders, the old coastal defense ships Eidsvold and Norge, with their 15 cm and 21 cm guns, were overwhelmed within 20 minutes. Eidsvold was destroyed by 4 torpedoes at approximately 4:37, killing 175 of her crew. Norge sank less than a minute after being struck amidships by the 2nd German torpedo salvo, with 101 men lost. Narvik was in German hands before the Norwegian garrison had properly woken up. The German position, on paper, was formidable. 10 modern destroyers, 1,900 troops ashore, and a port facility critical to the Reich's war economy. But underneath that strength lay a vulnerability that Commodore Bonte could not disguise: fuel. The destroyers had arrived at Narvik almost dry. The plan had called for 2 replenishment tankers, Kattegat and the converted whale factory ship Jan Wellem, each delivering some 600 short tons of fuel oil. Kattegat never arrived. She had been sunk in Glomfjord on the evening of the 9th of April by the Norwegian fishery protection ship Nordkapp, delayed by British mining operations during Operation Wilfred. A 3rd tanker, Skagerrak, had been redirected to Trondheim and was subsequently intercepted and scuttled. Only Jan Wellem made it to Narvik, and she was ill-equipped for the task: improvised refueling arrangements, inferior pumping equipment. Only 2 destroyers could be refueled simultaneously, and each evolution took 7 to 8 hours. By 4 o'clock on the 10th of April, Jan Wellem had fully fueled just 3 of Bonte's 10 ships, and was still in the process of refueling 2 more. 5 destroyers remained tied to the tanker or riding at reduced readiness across the fjord and its branches. The garrison that looked so powerful from the outside was, in reality, a force with its trousers around its ankles. Into that situation came the British response, the 2nd Destroyer Flotilla under Captain Bernard Warburton-Lee, pushing up Ofotfjord in the early hours of the 10th of April with 5 destroyers. The Germans had numbers and prepared positions. But the British had surprise, the pre-dawn darkness, and the knowledge, thanks to a signal Warburton-Lee sent from Tranai, that the enemy's exact dispositions were unknown and the odds worse than first estimated. Warburton-Lee pressed on regardless. And when the Battle of the 10th of April was over, 2 German destroyers had been sunk, Wilhelm Heidkamp, with Commodore Bonte killed aboard, and Anton Schmitt, and 3 more had been damaged. The British lost 2 destroyers of their own, including Hardy, with Warburton-Lee killed. It was a costly, brutal, and tactically inconclusive exchange. The Germans still held Narvik. 5 of Bonte's destroyers remained afloat, battered but present, and they still held the port. What the first battle had done, however, was confirm the strategic stakes. Narvik could not be left in German hands. A second, larger operation would have to be mounted, one with the weight to finish the job. And it was in the planning and execution of that second operation, mounted on the 13th of April, 1940, that HMS Savage and ships like her would prove that the word expendable had been applied far too casually. The S-class destroyers that formed the backbone of several British flotillas by 1940 were not glamorous ships. Launched in the late 1930s and early 1940s, HMS Savage herself was laid down and launched in 1942, representing the continuing development of a proven type. They were workhorses of the destroyer program, reliable, fast enough, adequately armed, but never described in the press releases that attended the Tribal class or the later fleet destroyers. They were tools, not trophies. The officers who commanded them were capable men who had learned their trade in the hard school of the Atlantic and the North Sea. Their crews were not the picked men of the fleet, they were the standard article, trained, professional, and accustomed to being told to go somewhere dangerous and hold it. What the S-class destroyers carried that the German 1934A and 1936 class ships did not, in the operational context of April 1940, was a full load of fuel. And in Ofotfjord, in the second week of April, that single logistical fact was more decisive than any comparison of gun calibers. The German destroyers ranged from 2,200 to 2,400 tons and mounted 5 12.7 cm guns apiece, a heavier broadside than most British destroyers of the period could match gun for gun. Their torpedo armament was substantial. On paper, a British destroyer engaging one of these ships in open water at equal terms was accepting a difficult fight. But the 5 German destroyers that remained operational after the first battle on the 10th of April were not at equal terms. They were dispersed across Ofotfjord and its subsidiary branches, Jangsford to the north, Rombaksfjord to the east, in various states of readiness, some still dependent on Jan Wellem for fuel, their magazines, and damage control parties worn by the first engagement and the chaotic hours that followed. The geography of Ofotfjord itself shaped what was possible. The fjord is narrow, deep-sided, and long, running roughly east to west, with the town of Narvik sitting at the point where Fjord and Rombaksfjord branch off to the south and east respectively. A force entering from the west held the initiative of movement. A force defending the fjord had the advantage of prepared positions but was constrained by the same narrow waters that made escape difficult. The Germans had recognized this. Erich Koellner had been positioned at the entrance to Jutvik to act as a lookout and picket. Diether von Roeder had been used to maintain control of the harbour area throughout the 9th and into the 10th. But after the losses of the 10th of April, the remaining German commanders were working with reduced assets, reduced fuel, and reduced confidence in their ability to predict where the next British attack would come from. If the account of the first battle had left the Germans chastened, the order of battle assembling for the second engagement should have alarmed them considerably. Admiral William Whitworth had transferred his flag to HMS Warspite, a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship, 33,000-ton standard displacement, mounting 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets. Each 15-inch shell weighed 879 kilograms. Warspite had been modernized in the 1930s, her fire control systems updated, and she carried a swordfish floatplane for spotting. Accompanying her were 9 destroyers. The firepower available to Whitworth on the 13th of April was not a raiding force, it was a deliberate, overwhelming application of naval weight designed to resolve the question of Narvik permanently, at sea if not yet on land. And still, against 5 remaining German destroyers, in a narrow fjord, with torpedo water all around, the destroyers tasked with leading that force into the fjord, pressing its flanks, and drawing out the enemy from their anchorages were doing exactly what the name implied. They were expendable. That was the operational theory. Send the smaller ships in first. Accept the losses. Bring the battleship's guns to bear on what emerged. What the theory underestimated was what the destroyers would actually do when they got there. If you find value in the kind of history that doesn't flinch from the arithmetic of risk, the logistical realities, the fuel states, the precise tonnages behind the grand decisions, then subscribing to this channel means the next ship's story will find you when it's ready. The morning of the 13th of April, 1940 began with Warspite Swordfish floatplane launching from the battleship at around 9:55, tasked with reconnaissance of the fjords ahead of the main force. This was not merely an intelligence-gathering exercise. The floatplane, piloted by Petty Officer F.C. Rice with Observer Lieutenant Commander W.L.M. Brown, would prove to be one of the most consequential aircraft of the Norwegian campaign. It located the German destroyer U-64, in fact a submarine, lying at anchor in Herjangsfjord, and sank her with 2 100-pound anti-submarine bombs, the first U-boat ever destroyed by a British aircraft in the Second World War. It then continued up Rombaksfjord, driving the damaged destroyer Erich Koellner from her hiding position and forcing her back towards the main fjord, directly into the path of Whitworth's advancing force. The British destroyers entered Ofotfjord shortly after 12 o'clock, with Warspite following several miles behind. The lead destroyers pushed the channel at speed, and at approximately 1 p.m., Erich Koellner, already damaged, unable to maneuver effectively, was caught in open water and engaged by HMS Bedouin, HMS Eskimo, HMS Forester, and HMS Hero. Koellner was struck repeatedly by 4.7-inch shells and torpedoes and reduced to a wreck. She eventually capsized and sank. Georg Thiele and Bernd von Arnim, attempting to contest the lower fjord, were engaged at ranges of between 3,000 and 8,000 yards by the advancing British destroyers and, subsequently, by Warspite's 15-inch guns. At approximately 13:08, Warspite opened fire with her main armament. The concussion of 879-kilogram shells falling in the narrow fjord was tremendous. Bernd von Arnim, already taking punishment from the British destroyers, was struck and driven towards the shallows. Georg Thiele fought on with fierce determination. She is credited with torpedoing HMS Eskimo, which had her bows blown off by the strike but remained afloat and was later salvaged. But Georg Thiele herself was by now critically damaged, her ammunition nearly exhausted. She was driven into Rombaksfjord, ran aground at Sildvik at the fjord's end, and was abandoned by her crew. Hans Lüdemann and Hermann Künne, attempting to escape up Rombaksfjord ahead of the British pursuit, were cornered. In waters too shallow and too narrow for effective maneuver, Lüdemann was beached and her crew scuttled her to prevent capture. Hermann Künne was similarly run aground and destroyed by her own crew at Tidens after it became clear there was no avenue of escape. Diether von Roeder, which had been used to cover the harbour throughout the previous days, was so badly damaged by gunfire from HMS Punjabi and other destroyers that she could not be moved. Her crew used her as a shore battery, firing her guns at the British ships until her ammunition was exhausted and she was finally destroyed. By the time the firing stopped in the late afternoon, the engagement having run from the first British destroyer contact at approximately 12 o'clock through to the final destruction of the last German warships, all 8 German destroyers that remained in Ofotfjord after the first battle had been accounted for. 2 had been sunk in the first engagement on the 10th of April. On the 13th of April, the remaining 5 were destroyed or scuttled. The total German destroyer loss at Narvik was 10 ships. The Kriegsmarine Group I that had arrived so confidently on the 9th of April no longer existed as a fighting force. British losses in the second battle were significant but survivable. HMS Eskimo lost her bow to a torpedo. HMS Punjabi suffered damage. Other destroyers took shell hits and casualties. But Warspite was undamaged, and the outcome was not in doubt by mid-afternoon. The immediate tactical result of the 13th of April was unambiguous. The Kriegsmarine had lost 10 destroyers, roughly one-third of its entire operational destroyer strength at that point in the war, to a campaign that lasted 4 days. General Diethel's mountain troops remained ashore, and the land battle for Narvik would continue until the Allied evacuation in early June 1940. But the German destroyers were gone, and with them any possibility of Kriegsmarine reinforcement of the garrison by sea. Diethel's men would fight on, increasingly isolated, supplied only by air. The destruction of the German destroyer flotilla at Narvik had consequences that extended far beyond the fjord. The Kriegsmarine surface fleet entered the Norwegian campaign with limited resources and exited it severely depleted. The losses at Narvik, combined with damage sustained by cruisers and capital ships elsewhere during the campaign, so reduced Germany's available surface forces that the planned invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, was considered unexecutable by German naval planners, who concluded they could not protect a crossing of the Channel against Royal Navy interference. The 10 destroyers lost in Ofotfjord were never replaced at equivalent pace. German destroyer construction, constrained by the competing demands of submarine production, could not fill the gap. The price paid at Narvik reverberated through German naval strategy for the remainder of the war. Whitworth's signal following the second battle noted the determined resistance of the German ships. Even in their desperate, fuel-starved condition, they had fought until they had nothing left to fight with. That determination cost the Kriegsmarine dearly. But it also underlined something that the British had confirmed at some cost, that the ships sent up the Fjord, the ones classified, in the strategic paperwork, as acceptable losses, as forces whose expenditure might purchase the destruction of a more valuable enemy, had delivered far more than expendability implied. They had carried a battleship's fire into a killing ground and held the Fjord until the work was done. In the cold arithmetic of April 1940, the destroyers of Ofotfjord had been assigned the kind of role that senior officers write with regret and junior officers execute without complaint. They were the advance guard, the bait, the force that would take the torpedo so that something more valuable could deliver the decisive blow. They went up that fjord knowing the geometry of the situation: narrow water, enemy on 3 sides, no room for error. They held the Narvik fjord for 9 hours. They drew out 5 German destroyers, absorbed the punishment of that narrow killing ground, and guided 879 kilogram shells to their targets. When it was over, the Kriegsmarine surface presence in Ofotfjord was ash and wreckage on the Norwegian seabed. Nobody ever called them expendable again. If this account of the destroyers of Narvik has earned your time, I'd be glad if you'd subscribe and turn on notifications so the next ship story comes straight to you. Thank you for watching.